Halloween live stream. We have a whole evening of spooky stories ahead, so make yourselves comfortable and prepare for a frightful journey into the darkness of the Cotswolds. We begin tonight with a whistle-stop tour of some of the most haunted places in the region. Come with me, if you dare. Hi there, I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorers Halloween Special. Stories of ghostly apparitions, cheeky poltergeists, and blood-curdling noises. When you've seen the film, by following the link in the description of this video, you can buy the guide on our website and visit the ghost-ridden places yourself. The Cotswolds is a region steeped in natural beauty, and we associate it with relaxation, wonderful architecture and views, and lovely hidden gems. The Cotswold Explorer loves spending the long summer days, bringing you interesting insights into the region, but tonight, alas not. In this special episode, we demonstrate how all lights can cast a shadow. Tonight, we are taking a look at the darker side of the Cotswolds, and we're going to show you a trail of the haunted places the region has to offer. So follow me, if you dare. On the western edge of the Cotswolds, on the outskirts of Cheltenham, we find the village of Prestbury. In the Middle Ages, this village had its own market and fair, but these medieval traditions have been somewhat overshadowed by the growth of Cheltenham, and it's now more or less a suburb of the broader city. The village centre, with its old church, has, however, managed to preserve its identity. But we begin our journey here tonight because it's renowned as the most haunted village in all of England. The village is said to be haunted by more than 24 ghostly apparitions. We start our investigation outside the church. There's evidence to suggest there was a church here before the times of the Domesday Book, and it is here that the most widely spotted phantom can be found. He's known as the Black Abbot, and is regularly seen in the precincts of the church and the graveyard. He can sometimes be spotted in the High Street too, most commonly on the 3 festival days of Christmas, Easter and All Saints' Day. Now the Cotswolds was far from spared the ravages of war. Both medieval conflicts and the English Civil War affected many settlements in the Cotswolds, and Prestbury is no exception. It is said that several ghostly horsemen have been seen galloping the lanes of this ancient place. One, a medieval rider who was evidently heading to Edward IV camp at Tewkesbury during the War of the Roses, was supposedly shot with a bow and arrow. During 20th century roadworks, a skeleton was discovered with an arrow lodged in its ribs. Could this be the mortal remains of the medieval spectre seen galloping through the village by night? Another horseman appears as a cavalier speeding through Prestbury, apparently during the Civil War. Prestbury's sympathies lay almost entirely with the parliamentarians, and they set up a number of primitive roadblocks to fortify the village against the king's army. These were rudimentary but effective, simple lengths of rope tied across the roads. This cavalier rode right into one stretched across Mill Lane, flinging him from his horse. Some men from the village lying in wait were quick to grab the unfortunate man and executed him on the spot. It's here that his spirit roams, riding his horse at full pelt, moments before he fell from his steed. There are many other spirits to tell of in Prestbury, spectral shepherds and strangled brides, so if you're hoping to experience a ghostly encounter, do come and find out more for yourselves. There are many grand houses and fortified structures around the Cotswolds, one of which is Sudeley Castle. Just outside Winchcombe, and built on the site of an earlier castle, Sudeley has a colourful and checkered history. It's been restored numerous times, and we will no doubt visit here another time to tell you the full history of the place. But for now, however, it's another spectacular hotspot of ghostly activity. One of the familiar phantoms seen around the grounds is that of Catherine Parr, the only wife of Henry VIII to survive him. Sudeley Castle was her home. After she died, she married Thomas Seymour, who was the younger sibling of Henry's previous wife, Jane Seymour. Catherine died after giving birth to her daughter Mary, and was interred in a vault here at Sudeley. Legend has it that during the 18th century, the castle being in a state of considerable dilapidation, John Lucas, who farmed the land around, happened across the coffin of the late Queen. Opening it, he found her body to be in a remarkably well-preserved condition. But having exposed it to the elements, however, the body soon crumbled to dust. Lucas was thoroughly reprimanded for the incident, but this did not stop him from interfering with it a second time. With the encouragement of his drinking friends, and well under the influence of the booze, they went and prized open the casket to inspect the contents. This was quickly to have fatal consequences, however, for soon afterwards Lucas went mad and died a sudden and unexpected death. His drinking friends also met premature and violent ends. Since this incident, the Queen has been seen wandering the grounds of Sudeley. She is described as tall, graceful, and wearing a green Tudor gown. A whiff of apple-scented perfume can be detected as she passes, occasionally accompanied by the sobs of a crying child. One notable encounter with her was in 1860. An estate worker called Fred Simmons was asked to fix a broken blind by the then chatelaine of the castle, Emma Dent. Having repaired the blind by candlelight one night, he was returning via the Chandos room when his candle was suddenly extinguished. This was shortly followed by a woman rushing past, who he assumed at the time to be Mrs. Dent. However, upon speaking to the castle housekeeper, one Mrs. Bayliss, he discovered that no other person had been upstairs at the time. Fred confessed that sometime before the incident he had taken a tooth from Catherine Parr's coffin. To quote his notebook, "Could it be so that the ghost of Catherine was permitted to roam over those old precincts, making night hideous, and to fill with awe those who had been guilty of robbing the dead?" Unsurprisingly, he was urged by his wife to return the tooth to the coffin. There are many other ghost stories from Sudeley, including the appearance of 2 King Charles spaniels and a large black Labrador. Employees and visitors have apparently seen a young girl in her 20s, a Victorian guest at the castle, roaming around the tithe barn. It's suggested that she had a holiday romance at the castle, and the barn is where she met her lover. Perhaps a more cheery note to finish on. Just outside Winchcombe, we find Hales Abbey. We visited here in episode 3 of Exploring the Cotswolds. Built in the 1240s by Richard, Duke of Cornwall, younger brother of Henry III, there have been sightings of phantom monks wandering amongst these ruins, and if you listen carefully, you may hear the sound of their chanting, particularly after dark. Continuing up the western escarpment, we're heading for the village of Broadway and the unusual folly, the Broadway Tower. The tower itself is not home to any ghoulish tales, but there is one story from the village. During the Reformation, destruction of churches took place across the country on a huge scale. A set of ancient bells from the church in Broadway was said to have been hidden at Middle Hill a couple of miles away in order to save them from destruction. These bells were apparently never recovered. Despite this, the ringing of distant church bells can sometimes be heard in the village, emanating from the nearby slopes of Middle Hill. They were reportedly at their loudest during the Second World War, when bell ringing was strictly prohibited. Another story tells of a local villager, Ephraim Rolfe. He was described as a gentle soul with a limited intellect, very much at one with children and animals. He earned a small living as a bird scarer in the local fields. One night, he met a violent end. As dusk settled on the field in which he was working, the local squire, mistaking him for a poacher, shot him dead. On dark and stormy nights, it is said that Ephraim can be seen wandering the fields, and, to quote J.A. Brooks, Ghosts and Witches of the Cotswolds, can sometimes be seen standing like a skeletal scarecrow. Chilling stuff. Climbing the steep escarpment, we drop off the main road towards Chipping Campden. Here is another classical Cotswold village, bustling with tourism at the height of summer. We visited Chipping Campden before and seen the huge cathedral-like St. James's Church, which is home to our next ghost story. This church is supposedly home to a cursed coffin. It's that of Juliana Gainsborough and is interred in the family vault. Anyone who touched it was said to drop dead within a week. During the 19th century, an agent visited the vault during an architectural inspection. A gravedigger warned the agent of the dangers of touching the coffin, but he chose to ignore the superstition. Sure enough, he fell ill the very next day and died the day after that. It's difficult to say why the coffin would be cursed, but one theory is that Lady Juliana became deranged after watching her home, Camden House, burned to the ground. It had been built in 1612 by Sir Baptist Hicks. During the Civil War, Chipping Campden was a royalist town, but it was at an important strategic position, and control of the place alternated between parliamentarian and royalist forces. In January 1645, Camden House was occupied by the royalist commander, Colonel Henry Bard, who went to great lengths to fortify the house. When he was redeployed in May of that year to join the King's forces at Evesham, he burnt Camden House to the ground in order to avoid it falling into the parliamentarian hands. Juliana clearly had a terrible time watching her home destroyed before her eyes, so perhaps her spirit did not rest peacefully after her death. Her ghost has been seen many times wandering between the church and what's left of Camden House. Just down the road towards the town, there have been some bizarre sightings of a dancing bear, who was supposedly shot by its short-tempered owner. It has apparently only been spotted on a few occasions, and always after closing time. Whether you're looking for a good ghost story or a wonderful place to visit, Chipping Campden has it all. Morton-in-Marsh is another lovely Cotswold town, built on the Fosse Way, a Roman road that crosses the Cotswold. In common with all the other places we've visited tonight, it has a number of spooky stories. The Manor House Hotel, formerly Creswick House, is said to be haunted by a Dame Creswick, who died there in the early 18th century. There is some speculation that she was murdered, but her spirit apparently bears no ill will or malevolence. It seems she's a benign presence, but has a habit of tidying things away into inconvenient hiding places. There is also a mischievous poltergeist at the Black Bear Inn. He's known as Fred. Sometimes he makes a nuisance of himself by pushing glasses off shelves and switching out the lights. And every now and then, the sound of an organ emanates from the corner of the bar, which presumably can also be attributed to Fred. A phantom cavalier has also been witnessed at the White Hart Royal Hotel. The hauntings here more commonly take the form of strange noises, distant footsteps in the night, doors opening and closing of their own accord, and eerie laughter emanating from empty rooms. Meanwhile, if you like a hug, the Bell Inn is the place to go. A friendly ghost here is said to hug the guests. Though nothing has ever been seen, visitors have said that the sensation of being clasped in someone's arms is unmistakable. Now, zigzagging across the region slightly, we move east to the famous Rollright Stones. We've told the story before of the witch that turned a king and his army to stone, but we just couldn't resist including more detail into tonight's ghost stories. It seems that as early as Tudor times, the Rollright Stones served as a meeting place for witches, but we think they were used much earlier than this, with some speculating that the stones exude some kind of ancient power of pagan origin. One tale tells of the murder in 1875 of one Mrs. Tennant from Long Compton, the village just below the Stones, who, having been accused of being a witch, was subsequently murdered. The murderer was James Haywood, who, believing he had been bewitched by Mrs. Tennant, took her life. It seems that Mrs. Tennant kept toads in her garden, and Haywood saw this as evidence of her witchcraft. He was arrested and imprisoned for life in Warwick Jail, where, believing himself still to be under the influence of Mrs. Tennant, he died slowly, refusing all food and water. Many say he may have been deeply influenced by a traditional local saying, "There are enough witches in Long Compton to draw a wagon-load of hay up Long Compton Hill." Another strange tale of these ancient stones involves any attempt to move or cause damage to them. A man from Banbury was said to have chipped off a piece of one of the stones, and with the shard in hand he attempted to leave in his horse and cart. The wheels were locked solid, preventing him from moving. Another time a soldier is said to have chipped a piece from one of the stones. He took it to India, and shortly after his arrival died of typhus. It shows the strength of the tendency of the locals to blame everything on witchcraft, that a man killed of a disease halfway round the planet was thought to have brought it on himself on a hill above Long Compton. In another eerie incident, a local farmer from Little Rollright wanted to build a bridge over one of his streams. He inspected the stones, and it seemed to him that a capstone from the Whispering Knights would serve his needs. It took 20 horses to haul the stone downhill, and 2 men were apparently killed in the process. Nevertheless, the farmer persevered, and the capstone was placed across the stream, forming the clapper bridge he so desired. But trouble ensued. Late that night, strange, unearthly sounds emanated from the stone, and in the morning he found the stone not laid over the stream as intended, but up on the bank, This was persuasion enough for him to return the stone to its rightful place. It took only one horse to haul the stone back up the hill, a sure sign that this was where it belonged. The Rollright Stones are a haunting place to visit. It is said one can never accurately count the number of stones that make up the king's men, but I would certainly invite you to try. Now we move back westward towards the central Cotswolds, arriving at the high point of Stow-on-the-Wold, where the wind blows cold. There was a brutal battle here during the Civil War. So dreadful was the carnage that ducks were said to be swimming in the blood of those that fell. The ghosts we are looking for, however, are from a more peaceful time. The King's Arms Hotel is over 500 years old and hosted Charles I on the 8th of May 1645. The hotel's ghost is not the monarch, but of a little old lady dressed in black silk and white lace. It looks as though she dates from the Victorian era and has been known to sit down next to unsuspecting guests to enjoy a more modern invention, the television. She also seems to enjoy playing with other electrical equipment, including turning the lights on and off. 2 phantom children have been seen, also apparently dating from the times of Queen Victoria. They have been blamed for some of the knocks and taps on the doors of guests' rooms in the early hours. And a man wearing high boots, waistcoat and bandolier has also been seen on the staircase. We continue our journey south now, turning off towards Burford, the gateway to the Cotswolds. Many of you who've watched our channel before will know that Burford is a town very familiar to us. The magnificent church of St. John the Baptist, one of the largest in the region, is beautiful by day and night, and an essential visit for the Cotswold traveller. It is said that at night time, in the depths of the winter, the bells ring of their own accord. Apparently they are heard by many in the town and seem to emanate from the church, but whenever the bells are inspected, they are always unattended. It seems nothing can be done to quiet them, and the phantom bells are still heard by many locals. Perhaps there's a scientific explanation, or perhaps it's linked to a story we've told you previously at this church. During the Civil War, the church was used as a prison for over 300 mutinous Roundhead soldiers. By the orders of Oliver Cromwell, 3 of them were shot in the churchyard in front of their fellow soldiers to serve as an example. They were known as the Levellers. The bells are not the only haunting known in Burford. The ghost of a man with a rifle has been sighted, sometimes stopping to take aim as if to fire, much to the alarm of the witnesses, who presume themselves to be his intended target. A ghostly monk is also said to wander the churchyard, as well as the neighbouring rectory. In the 17th century, Lord and Lady Tanfield came to Burford. They lived in Burford Priory, a beautiful medieval building that had been converted from a priory into a private home. Lawrence Tanfield rose so high in society that in 1603 he entertained King James I at the priory. Lawrence and his wife were disliked by many in the town. If he was a difficult person to like, his wife Elizabeth was harsher by far. She considered the townsfolk entirely inferior. At one point, she is quoted as saying, "I'd like to grind the people of Burford to powder under my chariot wheels." There are also tales of Lord Tanfield cheating his neighbours. All in all, the pair were universally loathed. In 1625, after a long life of squeezing the townspeople dry, Sir Lawrence died, and Elizabeth followed shortly afterwards. The locals breathed a great sigh of relief, But Tanfield-free life was short-lived. Such strong characters are seldom expected to rest quietly. After their deaths, the spirits of Lord and Lady Tanfield returned to terrify their neighbours. On the darkest of nights it is said they would ride their fiery chariot over the rooftops of the town with loud cackling and terrifying shrieks. For years the people lived in fear as the haunting continued. By the 18th century, the locals were so fed up with this phantom chariot, they decided something had to be done. 7 clergymen were summoned to lay the malevolent spirits to rest. After a long chase, the clergymen finally drove the pair to the churchyard. Unfortunately, this was where they were at their strongest. At the east end of the church, in the chapel of St. Catherine, looms their huge, colourful tomb with their hard-faced effigies upon it. The clergymen didn't want this to be their last resting place, and they managed to force them into a bottle. Clutching this bottle with all the strength and willpower they could summon, they dashed down to the bridge over the River Windrush and hurled the bottle into the depths of the river. There it stayed, the spirits finally at rest. The town of Burford could sleep soundly at last. It is said that should the River Windrush ever run dry under the first arch of the bridge, the Tanfields will rise again to torment the town. For many years, the town remained in peace until, in one particularly dry spell at the turn of the 20th century, it became so unusually hot that the river ran down to a trickle, and the puddles beneath the bridge, where the bottle had sunk, began to hiss and bubble. It was as if the Tanfields were making their way back from hell. The townsfolk acted promptly. So desperately were they to keep evil spirits from rising again, they formed a bucket chain from upriver to make sure the spot didn't dry up completely. And to this day, the Tanfields have never risen again. Who knows? Maybe one day, another heat wave will bring the Tanfields back to life. Moving east off the edge of the Cotswolds, just before the bustling market town of Witney, we round off our whistle-stop ghost tour in the ruins of Minster Lovell Hall. These oddly beautiful ruins stand beside the wonderfully clear River Windrush and next to the nearby church of Saint Kenelm. Both are well worth a visit. Within these ruins, strange groans have been heard, echoing eerily around the place. This would have been a very grand house. It was built in 1430 by the Lovell family. Lord Lovell was a figure of mystery, enjoying prosperity as King Richard III's confidant. However, in 1485, after Richard was defeated by Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth, Lovell became a wanted man. Subsequently, he seems to have disappeared completely from the history books. Perhaps there's a sinister connection in the wailing heard for centuries around Minster Lovell. When the Wars of the Roses were over, Lovell fled back to the Minster and hid in a secret vault. He gave his servant the only key, charging him to look after his well-being and safety. Unfortunately, the servant died shortly afterwards, and no one was left to tend to Lord Lovell, with, apparently, the inevitable result. It is said that a few hundred years later, in 1708, a skeleton was discovered in the ruins of the house, surrounded by mouldy books and the skeleton of a small dog. Could this be the mortal remains of the ghoul who wails in the small hours of the morning? I suppose it's possible. But there is another earlier tale from Minster Lovell. A woman dressed in white has been spotted wandering around, climbing a long-since-vanished staircase in the main hall. The story goes that the lady in white suffered the same horrible fate as Lord Lovell himself. Many years ago, it was customary for a bride to be kidnapped by the groom's friends and taken to the church. The girl was expected to appear to try and evade her kidnappers in a game of hide and seek. She would eventually be found by the young men, and after much merriment the game would be up. On this occasion, however, the fun and games turned into tragedy. The bride-to-be hid inside an oak chest in the attic, the lid of which clicked shut, tragically sealing her doom. No one heard her calls for help, and the hiding place would become her premature coffin. It was many years before she was discovered, a skeleton in a tattered wedding dress. Some say that it is her groom, William, who wanders the precincts of the Minster Lovell Hall, searching for his bride, wailing sadly into the night sky. There are many other scary tales from all over the Cotswolds. Some we've mentioned in previous years, others we have yet to uncover. We may well do so in time for next Halloween. At the very northern tip of the Cotswolds at Edge Hill, where the first pitched battle of the English Civil War took place, there are tales of phantom armies on the move, fighting one another in the sky. It was so widely reported by locals at the time that the king actually sent a commission to investigate, and the records of their conclusions survive to this day. In a previous episode, we spoke about Chavenage House near Tetbury in the southern Cotswold, where the headless ghost of King Charles I arrived to carry off the dead Colonel Nathaniel Stevens, who had opposed him during the Civil War. As the horse and carriage left the grounds, it reportedly burst into flames. Cheltenham, Cirencester, and even stately homes such as Snow's Hill Manor and Berkeley Castle all carry further ghostly tales. All stories for another time. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more ghost stories, don't forget our audiobooks are available over on our website. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow us on all the social media platforms. Good night and happy Halloween. Next up, we have a chilling tale which some of you may remember, The Tomb of Sarah by F.G. Loring. It's an horrific story of a vampire werewolf terrorizing a small village in the heart of the Cotswolds. The story is available as an audiobook. Simply follow the link in the description to listen to it. Hello. You find me on the day of Halloween in the depths of the Cotswolds, and I'm searching for some of the most gruesome tales told about the area. There are many of them. Some terrible things have happened in the Cotswolds in the past. I'm going to find them, and then I'm going to read them to you. My father was the head of a celebrated firm of church restorers and decorators about 60 years ago.
He took a keen interest in his work and made an especial study of any old legends or family histories that came under his observation. He was necessarily very well read and thoroughly well posted in all questions of folklore and medieval legend. As he kept a careful record of every case he investigated, the manuscripts he left at his death have a special interest. From amongst them, I have selected the following as being a particularly weird and extraordinary experience. In presenting it to the public, I feel it is superfluous to apologize for its supernatural character. My father's diary. 1841, June the 17th. Received a commission from my old friend Peter Grant to enlarge and restore the chancel of his church at Haggerstone in the wilds of the Cotswolds. July the 5th, went down to Haggerstone with my head man, Summers, a very long and tiring journey. July the 7th, got the work well started. The old church is one of special interest to the antiquarian, and I shall endeavour while restoring it to alter the existing arrangements as little as possible. One large tomb, however, must be moved bodily 10 feet at least to the southward. Curiously enough, there is a somewhat forbidding inscription upon it in Latin, and I'm sorry that this particular tomb should have to be moved. It stands amongst the graves of the Kenyons, an old family which has been extinct in these parts for centuries. The inscription on it runs thus: Sarah, 1630. For the sake of the dead and the welfare of the living, let this sepulchre remain untouched and its occupant undisturbed till the coming of Christ. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. July the 8th, took counsel with Grant concerning the Sarah tomb. We are both very loath to disturb it, but the ground has sunk so beneath it that the safety of the church is in danger. Thus, we have no choice. However, the work shall be done as reverently as possible under our own direction. Grant says there is a legend in the neighbourhood that it is the tomb of the last of the Kenyons, the evil Countess Sarah, who was murdered in 1630. She lived quite alone in the old castle, whose ruins still stand 3 miles from here on the road to Bristol. Her reputation was an evil one even for those days. She was a witch or werewoman, the only companion of her solitude being a familiar in the shape of a huge Asiatic wolf. This creature was reputed to seize upon children, or failing these, sheep and other small animals, and convey them to the castle where the Countess used to suck their blood. It was popularly supposed that she could never be killed. This, however, proved a fallacy, since she was strangled one day by a mad peasant woman who had lost 2 children, she declaring that they had both been seized and carried off by the Countess's familiar. This is a very interesting story, since it points to a local superstition very similar to that of the vampire existing in Slavonic and Hungarian Europe. The tomb is built of black marble, surmounted by an enormous slab of the same material. On the slab is a magnificent group of figures. A young and handsome woman reclines upon a couch. Round her neck is a piece of rope, the end of which she holds in her hand. At her side is a gigantic dog with bared fangs and lolling tongue. The face of the reclining figure is a cruel one. The corners of the mouth are curiously lifted, showing the sharp points of long canine or dog teeth. The whole group, though magnificently executed, leaves a most unpleasant sensation. If we move the tomb, it will have to be done in 2 pieces, the covering slab first and then the tomb proper. We have decided to remove the covering slab tomorrow. June the 9th, 6 p.m. a very strange day. By noon, everything was ready for lifting off the covering stone, and after the men's dinner we started the jacks and pulleys. The slab lifted easily enough, though it fitted closely into its seat, and was further secured by some sort of mortar or putty, which must have kept the interior perfectly airtight. None of us was prepared for the horrible rush of foul, mouldy air that escaped as the cover lifted clear of its seating. And the contents that gradually came into view were more startling still. There lay the fully dressed body of a woman, wizened and shrunk and ghastly pale as if from starvation. Round her neck was a loose cord, and judging by the scars still visible, the story of death of strangulation was true enough. The most horrible part, however, was the extraordinary freshness of the body. Except for the appearance of starvation, life might have been only just extinct. The flesh was soft and white, the eyes were wide open and seemed to stare at us with a fearful understanding in them. The body itself lay on mould without any pretense to coffin or shell. For several moments we gazed with horrible curiosity, and then it became too much for my workmen, who implored us to replace the covering slab. That, of course, we would not do, but I set the carpenters to work at once to make a temporary cover while we moved the tomb to its new position. This is a long job and will take 2 or 3 days at least. June the 9th, 9 p.m. Just at sunset, we were startled by the howling of seemingly every dog in the village. It lasted for 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, and then ceased as suddenly as it had begun. This, and a curious mist that had risen round the church, makes me feel rather anxious about the Sarah tomb. According to the best established traditions of the vampire-haunted countries, the disturbance of dogs or wolves at sunset is supposed to indicate the presence of one of these fiends, and local fog is always considered to be a certain sign. The vampire has the power of producing it for the purpose of concealing its movements near its hiding place at any time. I dare not mention or even hint my fears to the rector, for he is, not unnaturally perhaps, a rank disbeliever in many things that I know from experience are not only possible, but even probable. I must work this out alone at first, and get his aid without his knowing in what direction he's helping me. I shall now watch till midnight at least. 10:15 p.m., as I feared and half expected. Just before 10, there was another outburst of the hideous howling. It was commenced most distinctly by a particularly horrible and blood-curdling wail from the vicinity of the churchyard. The chorus lasted only a few minutes, however, and at the end of it I saw a large, dark shape, like a huge dog, emerge from the fog and lope away at a rapid canter towards the open country. Assuming this to be what I fear, I shall see it return soon after midnight. 12:30 p.m. I was right. Almost as midnight struck, I saw the beast returning. It stopped at the spot where the fog seemed to commence, and lifting up its head, gave tongue to that particularly horrible long-drawn wail that I had noticed as preceding the outburst early in the evening. Tomorrow I shall tell the rector what I've seen, and if, as I expect, we hear some neighbouring sheepfold have been raided, I shall get him to watch with me for this nocturnal marauder. I shall also examine the Sarah tomb for something which he may notice without any previous hint from me. July the 10th. I found the workmen this morning much disturbed in mind about the howling of the dogs. "We don't like it, sir," one of them said to me. "We don't like it. There was somebody abroad last night that was unholy." They were still more uncomfortable when the news came round that a large dog had made a raid upon a flock of sheep, scattering them far and wide and leaving 3 of them dead with torn throats in the field. When I told the rector of what I'd seen and what was being said in the village, he immediately decided that we must try and catch, or at least identify, the beast I'd seen. "Of course," said he, "it is some dog lately imported into the neighbourhood, for I know of nothing about here nearly as large as the animal you describe, though its size may be due to the deceptive moonlight." This afternoon I asked the rector as a favour to assist me in lifting the temporary cover that was on the tomb, giving as an excuse the reason that I wished to obtain a portion of the curious mortar with which it had been sealed. After a slight demur, he consented, and we raised the lid. If the sight that met our eyes gave me a shock, at least it appalled Grant. "Great God!" he exclaimed. "The woman is alive!" And so it seemed for a moment. The corpse had lost much of its starved appearance and looked hideously fresh and alive. It was still wrinkled and shrunken, but the lips were firm and of the rich red hue of health. The eyes, if possible, were more appalling than ever, though fixed and staring. At one corner of the mouth, I thought I noticed a slight dark-coloured froth, but I said nothing about it then. "Take your piece of mortar, Harry," gasped Grant, "and let us shut the tomb again. God help me! Parson though I am, such dead faces frighten me." Nor was I sorry to hide that terrible face again. But I got my bit of mortar, and I have advanced a step towards the solution of the mystery. This afternoon the tomb was moved several feet towards its new position, but it will be 2 or 3 days yet before we shall be ready to replace the slab. 10:15 p.m. Again the same howling at sunset, the same fog enveloping the church, and at 10 o'clock the same great beast slipping silently out into the open country. I must get the rector's help and watch for its return. But precautions we must take, for if things are as I believe, we take our lives in our hands when we venture out into the night to waylay the vampire. Why not admit it at once? For that the beast I have seen is the vampire of that evil thing in the tomb, I can have no reasonable doubt. Not yet come to its full strength, thank heaven, after the starvation of nearly 2 centuries, for at present it can only maraud as wolf, apparently. But in a day or 2, when full power returns, that dreadful woman in her new strength and beauty will be able to leave her refuge. Then it would not be sheep merely that would satisfy her disgusting lust for blood, but victims that would yield their lifeblood without a murmur to her caressing touch. Victims that, dying of her foul embrace, themselves must become vampires in their turn to prey on others. Mercifully, my knowledge gives me a safeguard, for that little piece of mortar that I rescued today from the tomb contains a portion of the sacred host, and who holds it, humbly and firmly believing in its virtue, may pass safely through such an ordeal as I intend to submit myself and the rector to tonight. 12:30 p.m. Our adventure is over for the present, and we are back safe. After writing the last entry recorded above, I went off to find Grant and tell him that the marauder was out on the prowl again. "But Grant," I said, "before we start out tonight, I must insist that you will let me prosecute this affair in my own way. You must promise to put yourself completely under my orders, without asking any questions as to why and wherefore." After a little demur, and some excusable chafe on his part, at the serious view I was taking of what he called a dog hunt, he gave me his promise. I then told him that we were to watch tonight and try and track the mysterious beast, but not to interfere with it in any way. I think, in spite of his jests, that I impressed him with the fact that there might be, after all, good reason for my precautions. It was just after 11 when we stepped out into the still night. Our first move was to try and penetrate the dense fog round the church, but there was something so chilly about it, and a faint smell so disgustingly rank and loathsome that neither our nerves nor our stomachs were proof against it. Instead, we stationed ourselves in the dark shadow of a yew tree that commanded a good view of the wicket entrance to the churchyard. At midnight, the howling of the dogs began again, and in a few minutes we saw a large grey shape with green eyes shining like lamps shamble swiftly down the path towards us. The rector started forward, but I laid a firm hand upon his arm and whispered a warning, "Remember." Then we both stood very still and watched as the great beast cantered swiftly by. It was real enough, for we could hear the clicking of its nails on the stone flags. It passed within a few yards of us and seemed to be nothing more nor less than a great grey wolf, thin and gaunt, with bristling hair and dripping jaws. It stopped where the mist commenced and turned round. It was truly a horrible sight, and made one's blood run cold. The eyes burned like fires, the upper lip was snarling and raised, showing the great canine teeth, while round the mouth clung and dripped a dark-coloured froth. It raised its head and gave tongue to its long, wailing howl, which was answered from afar by the village dogs. After standing for a few moments, it turned and disappeared into the thickest part of the fog. Very shortly afterwards, the atmosphere began to clear, and within 10 minutes the mist was all gone. The dogs in the village were silent, and the night seemed to resume its normal aspect. We examined the spot where the beast had been standing, and found, plainly enough upon the stone flags, dark spots of froth and saliva. "Well, Rector," I said, "will you admit now, in view of the things you have seen today, in consideration of the legend, the woman in the tomb, the fog, the howling dogs, and last but not least, the mysterious beast you have seen so close, that there is something not quite normal in it all? Will you put yourself unreservedly in my hands and help me, whatever I may do, to first make assurance doubly sure, and finally take the necessary steps for putting an end to this horror of the night?" I saw that the uncanny influence of the night was strong upon him, and wished to impress it as much as possible. "Needs must," he replied, "when the devil drives, and in the face of what I have seen, I must believe that some unholy forces are at work. Yet how can they work in the sacred precincts of a church? Shall we not call rather upon heaven to assist us in our need?" "Grant," I said solemnly, "that we must do, each in his own way. But God helps those who help themselves, and by his help and the night of my knowledge, we must fight this battle for him and the poor lost soul within." We then returned to the rectory and to our rooms, though I have sat up to write this account while the scene is fresh in my mind. July the 11th. Found the workmen again very much disturbed in their minds and full of a strange dog that had been seen during the night by several people who had hunted it. Farmer Stotman, who had been watching his sheep, the same flock that had been raided the night before, had surprised it over a fresh carcass and tried to drive it off, but its size and fierceness so alarmed him that he had beaten a hasty retreat for a gun. When he returned, the animal was gone, though he found that 3 more sheep from his flock were dead and torn. The Sarah tomb was moved today to its new position, but it was a long, heavy business, and there wasn't time to replace the covering slab. For this I was glad, as in the prosaic light of day, the rector almost disbelieves the events of the night, and is prepared to think everything to have been magnified and distorted by our imagination. As, however, I could not possibly proceed with my way of extermination against this foul thing without assistance, and as there is nobody else I can rely upon, I appealed to him for one more night to convince him that it was no delusion, but a ghastly, horrible truth which must be fought and conquered for our own sakes, as well as that of all those living in the neighbourhood. Put yourself in my hands, Rector, I said, for tonight at least. Let us take those precautions which my study of the subject tells me are the right ones. Tonight you and I must watch in the church, and I feel assured that tomorrow you will be as convinced as I am, and be equally prepared to take those awful steps which I know to be proper, and I must warn you that we shall find a more startling change in the body lying there than you noticed yesterday. My words came true, for on raising the wooden cover once more, the rank stench of a slaughterhouse arose, making us feel positively sick. There lay the vampire, but now changed from the starved and shrunken corpse we saw 2 days ago for the first time. The wrinkles had almost disappeared, the flesh was firm and full, the crimson lips grinned horribly over the long pointed teeth, and a distinct smear of blood had trickled down one corner of the mouth. We set our teeth, however, and hardened our hearts. Then we replaced the cover and put what we had collected into a safe place in the vestry. Yet even now Grant could not believe that there was any real or pressing danger concealed in that awful tomb, as he raised strenuous objections to any apparent desecration of the body without further proof. This he shall have tonight. God grant that I am not taking too much on myself. If there is any truth in old legends, it will be easy enough to destroy the vampire now, but Grant will not have it. I hope for the best of this night's work, but the danger in waiting is very great. 6 p.m. I have prepared everything, the sharp knives, the pointed stake, fresh garlic, and the wild dog roses. All these I have taken and concealed in the vestry, where we can get at them when our solemn vigil commences. If either or both of us die with our fearful task undone, let those reading my records see that this is done. I lay it upon them as a solemn obligation, that the vampire be pierced through the heart with the stake. Then let the burial service be read over the poor clay at last released from its doom. Thus shall the vampire cease to be, and a lost soul rest. July the 12th. All is over. After the most terrible night of watching and horror, one vampire at least will trouble the world no more. But how thankful should we be to a merciful providence that that awful tomb was not disturbed by anyone not having the knowledge necessary to deal with its dreadful occupant. I write this with no feelings of self-complacency, but simply with a great gratitude for the years of study I have been able to devote to this special subject. So now for my tale. Just before sunset last night, the rector and I locked ourselves into the church and took up our position in the pulpit. It was one of those pulpits to be found in some churches which is entered from the vestry, the preacher appearing at a good height through an arched opening in the wall. This gave us a sense of security, which we felt we needed, a good view of the interior, and direct access to the implements which I had concealed in the vestry. The sun set, and the twilight gradually deepened and faded. There was so far no sign of the usual fog, nor any howling of the dogs. At 9 o'clock the moon rose, and her pale light gradually flooded the aisles, and still no sign of any kind from the Sarah tomb. The rector had asked me several times what he might expect, but I was determined that no words or thoughts of mine should influence him, and that he should be convinced by his own senses alone. By 10:30, we were both getting very tired, and I began to think that perhaps after all we should see nothing that night. However, soon after 11, we observed a light mist rising from the Sarah tomb. It seemed to scintillate and sparkle as it rose, and curled in a sort of pillar or spiral. I said nothing, but I heard the rector give a sort of gasp as he clutched my arm feverishly. "Great heaven," he whispered, "it's taking shape." And true enough, in a very few moments we saw standing erect by the tomb the ghastly figure of the Countess Sarah. She looked thin and haggard still, and her face was deadly white, but the crimson lips looked like a hideous gash in the pale cheeks, and her eyes glared like red coals in the gloom of the church. It was a fearful thing to watch as she stepped unsteadily down the aisle, staggering a little as if from weakness and exhaustion. This was perhaps natural, as her body must have suffered much physically from her long incarceration, in spite of the unholy forces which kept it fresh and well. We watched her to the door and wondered what would happen, but it appeared to present no difficulty, for she melted through it and disappeared. "Now, Grant," I said, "do you believe?" "Yes," he replied, "I must. Everything is in your hands, and I will obey your commands to the letter, if you can only instruct me how to rid my poor people of this unnameable terror." "By God's help I will," said I, "but you shall be yet more convinced first, for we have a terrible work to do, and much to answer for in the future, before we leave the church again this morning. And now to work, for in its present weak state the vampire will not wander far, but may return at any time, and must not find us unprepared." We stepped down from the pulpit, and taking dog roses and garlic from the vestry, proceeded to the tomb. I arrived first, and throwing off the wooden cover, cried, "Look, it's empty!" There was nothing there, nothing except the impress of the body in the loose, damp mould. I took the flowers, laid them in a circle around the tomb, for legend teaches us that vampires will not pass over these particular blossoms if they can avoid it. Then, 8 or 10 feet away, I made a circle on the stone pavement, large enough for the rector and myself to stand in, and within the circle I placed the implements that I had brought into the church with me. "Now," I said, "from this circle, which nothing unholy can step across, you shall see the vampire face to face, and see her afraid to cross that other circle of garlic and dog roses to regain her unholy refuge. But on no account step beyond the holy place you stand in, for the vampire has a fearful strength, not her own, and like a snake can draw her victim willingly to his own destruction." Now so far my work was done, and calling the rector, we stepped into the holy circle to await the vampire's return. Nor was this long delayed. Presently a damp, cold odour seemed to pervade the church, which made our hair bristle and flesh to creep. And then, down the aisle with noiseless feet, came that which we watched for. I heard the rector mutter a prayer, and I held him tightly by the arm, for he was shivering violently. Long before we could distinguish the features, we saw the glowing eyes and the crimson, sensual mouth. She went straight to her tomb, but stopped short when she encountered my flowers. She walked right round the tomb, seeking a place to enter, and as she walked, she saw us. A spasm of diabolical hate and fury passed over her face, but it quickly vanished, and a smile of love, more devilish still, took its place. She stretched out her arms towards us. Then we saw that round her mouth gathered a bloody froth, and from under her lips long pointed teeth gleamed and champed. She spoke, a soft, soothing voice, a voice that carried a spell with it, and affected us both strangely, particularly the rector. I wished to test as far as possible, without endangering our lives, the vampire's power. Her voice had a soporific effect, which I resisted easily enough, but which seemed to throw the rector into a sort of trance. More than this, it seemed to compel him to her in spite of his efforts to resist. "Come," she said, "come, I give sleep and peace, sleep and peace, sleep and peace." She advanced a little towards us, but not far, for I noticed that the sacred circle seemed to keep her back like an iron hand. My companion seemed to become demoralized and spellbound. He tried to step forward, and finding me detain him, whispered, "Harry, let go. I must go. She's calling me. I must. Oh, help me, help me." And he began to struggle. It was time to finish. "Grant," I cried in a loud, firm voice, "in the name of all that you hold sacred, have done and play the man." He shuddered. At this, a look of damnable hate changed the smiling face before us, and with a sort of shriek she staggered back. "Back," I cried, "back to your unholy tomb. No longer shall you molest the suffering world. Your end is near." It was fear that now showed itself in her beautiful face, for it was beautiful in spite of its horror, and she shrank back and over the circlet of flowers, shivering as she did so. At last, with a low, mournful cry, she appeared to melt back again into her tomb. As she did so, the first gleams of the rising sun lit up the world, and I knew all danger was over for the day. Taking Grant by the arm, I drew him with me out of the circle and led him to the tomb. There lay the vampire once more, still in her living death as we had a moment before seen her in her devilish life. But in the eyes remained that awful expression of hate and cringing, appalling fear. Grant has pulled himself together. "Now," I said, "will you dare the last terrible act and rid the world forever of this horror?" "By God," he said solemnly, "I will. Tell me what to do." "Help me to lift her out of the tomb. She can harm us no more," I replied. And with averted faces we set to our terrible task and laid her out upon the flags. "Now," I said, "read the burial service over the poor body, and then let us give it its release from this living hell that holds it." Reverently the rector read the beautiful words, and reverently I made the necessary responses. And when it was over, I took the stake, and without giving myself time to think, plunged it with all my strength through the heart. As though really alive, the body for a moment writhed and kicked convulsively, and an awful heart-rending shriek woke the silent church. Then all was still. We lifted the poor body back, and thank God the consolation that legend tells is never denied to those who have to do such awful work as ours, came at last. Over the face stole a great and solemn peace. The lips lost their crimson hue, the prominent sharp teeth sank back into the mouth, and for a moment we saw before us the calm, pale face of a most beautiful woman who smiled as she slept. A few minutes more, and she faded away to dust before our eyes as we watched. We set to work and cleaned up every trace of our work, and then departed for the rectory. Most thankful were we to step out of the church, with its horrible associations, into the rosy warmth of the summer morning. With the above end the notes of my father's diary, though a few days later this further entry occurs. July the 15th. Since the 12th, everything has been quiet and as usual. We replaced and sealed up the Sarah tomb this morning. The workmen were surprised to find the body had disappeared, but took it to be the natural result of exposing it to the air. One odd thing came to my ears today. It appears that the child of one of the villagers strayed from home the night of the 11th and was found asleep in a coppice near the church, very pale and quite exhausted. There were 2 small marks on her throat, which have since disappeared. What does this mean? I have, however, kept it to myself, as now that the vampire is no more, no further danger either to that child or any other is to be apprehended. It is only those who die of the vampire's embrace that become vampires at death in their turn. I hope you've enjoyed our stories. We certainly have. There are many, many more. I think we'll certainly do this again. Meanwhile, have a wonderful Halloween and keep safe. I do hope you've enjoyed our scary stories so far. Remember to press the subscribe button. We now bring you another Cotswold tour, this time following a gruesome trail of horrific events. Theft, murder, poison and hangings. They're all to come in the next episode. Hi there, I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer's second Halloween special. This time we found true stories of murder, corruption, deceit and villainy, which demonstrate that under the cloak of beauty and peace for which the Cotswolds are famous, lurks a darker and more sinister truth. Once you've enjoyed the stories, by following the link in the description of this video, you can buy your own guidebook. Regular viewers will know that we're normally accustomed to bringing you interesting insights into the history and heritage of the region, but tonight we're presenting you with some of the darker sides of the place. This picture postcard, beautiful place, has on many occasions played host to murder, theft, beatings, and alcohol-fueled crimes of one kind or another. In this Halloween special, we're going to tell you a selection of these horrific tales, beginning at the very northern tip of the region, somewhere we visited quite recently, the Quintons. In the little Warwickshire village of Lower Quinton in the summer of 2021, we merely scratched the surface of this sinister tale. The night of Valentine's Day, 1945, is a night long remembered in the Quintons. It was on that night that Charles Walton, a local farm labourer, was found murdered at the Firs farm on the slopes of Meon Hill. Even before this event, Meon Hill had been linked to many folklore stories involving devil worship, so it is perhaps fitting that such a gruesome event took place here. There is all kinds of speculation around the motive, including ideas as far-fetched as witchcraft and black magic. However, the residents of Quinton are renowned for their silence on the subject, and as recorded during a visit from the BBC some decades later, are tight-lipped to this day.
we must tread carefully. Charles lived in a cottage opposite the church in Lower Quinton, renting it with his niece, Edie. The cottage is still there today, converted into one large property. Charles was apparently well liked in the village, although described as something of a recluse and a loner, with a reputation for having an affinity with the animal kingdom. He had trained horses in his youth. It is said that wild birds would flock to his hand to be fed, and angry dogs could be tamed at the sound of his voice. He was a countryman through and through, familiar with many rural rituals and the ways of countryside. He was perhaps too familiar with it, for it is said that after seeing his strange abilities at work, some villagers believed him to be involved with witchcraft. When his body was found, his throat had been slashed by his own billhook, the implement with which he'd been trimming the hedgerows, and he was pinned to the ground by the neck with his own pitchfork. Witchcraft was certainly suspected, as a large cross was found carved into his chest. Previous cases have documented that people have murdered those they believed have put them under a spell. A cross carved into the victim was a sign of the person taking their revenge. To add to the witchcraft connection, during the investigation, a police officer found a book entitled Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespeare Land, written in 1929 by J. Harvey Bloom. A passage in the book tells of a Charles Walton who had died in 1885, 60 years before our victim, after seeing a foreboding ghost. As a result of this discovery, rumours started to circulate suggesting that because of his alleged involvement with witchcraft, the more recently killed Charles Walton was the same man as the earlier victim. It was a notable case even at the time, and one of the most distinguished policemen in the country was called in to lead the investigation. Chief Inspector Robert Fabian of the Yard. However, despite his best efforts, the crime has never been solved. He had his suspicions, but he could prove nothing. Years later, though the event of that Valentine's Day remains fresh in the minds of the villagers, they were unquestionably tight-lipped. In the 1970s, the BBC nationwide programme visited here in an attempt to discuss the case, but we hear tell that when they went to the local pub in Lower Quinton to interview the locals, the place suddenly emptied of customers, and no one would speak to them. Surprisingly, Charles Walton doesn't seem actually to have a grave in the churchyard. All that can be found is a small headstone with the initials marked CHW. This seems odd, but one theory has been suggested that it was destroyed by a relative who became upset by the media attention, and the journalists who constantly visited the grave on the anniversary of his death. There are a number of footpaths round Meon Hill, so if you like a walk, don your walking boots and explore for yourself. If you choose to follow his path, tread carefully. From here we move south, back into the more familiar central Cotswolds, arriving first at the wonderful village of Chipping Campden. Our story here is from the early 19th century, the year 1835. This is an unusual crime because the criminal doesn't meet the usual stereotype. Harriet Tarver was just 21 when she committed her act of willful murder. She was a young mother with a perfectly decent record, living in Sheep Street. Her parents were both local, her father an agricultural worker by the name of William Tracy, and her mother, Sarah. Harriet was married at 19 to the 24-year-old Thomas Tarver. She had been to school and could read a little, but couldn't write at all. She worked by her husband's side as a labourer. In September 1834, the couple had had their first and only child, a daughter they named after Harriet's paternal grandmother, Anne. They lived a normal working-class life in Chipping Campden, attracting little attention, until one day, December the 11th, 1835, Thomas died very suddenly. He was young, fit and apparently healthy, so given that it was such a small community where everybody knew one another, it wasn't long before rumours of foul play and murder started to circulate. A few days after Thomas's death, on the 15th of December, an inquest was started. The inquest was not initially presented with any evidence of foul play, but it was adjourned for a week, and during this time, arsenic was discovered in Thomas's stomach. A couple of witnesses came forward to say that they had seen Harriet Tarver purchasing arsenic from a shop. They couldn't think why she would need it, but equally, why she would want her husband dead. The inquest jury, after some considerable discussion, returned a verdict of wilful murder, and a trial took place on Friday the 8th of April, 1836. On the day Thomas died, he had gone to work at the Knowle Arms in Chipping Campden as normal, leaving the house at around 4 a.m. It was shortly after his arrival that he began to complain of stomach pains. He was sick several times, and by the afternoon he was dead. 2 days prior to this, Harriet had bought some rice pudding, and on the day Thomas died she had given it to him for breakfast. It was in this pudding that she had hidden the arsenic. As she had been seen by several people buying the arsenic, it was rash of her to think she could administer it without question. Not the sharpest knife in the box, perhaps. Maybe she didn't think through the consequences. A post-mortem was carried out on Thomas, and arsenic was easily identified in his stomach. In fact, the coroner, Dr. Thompson, said he had never seen a stomach in such a state. It was as a result of these findings that Harriet Tarver was convicted of murder. It would seem, to her surprise, she had apparently fully expected to be acquitted.
She finally confessed to killing Thomas, and the press reported that her motive was that she was in love with another man. She was not given much time to reflect upon her crime, however, for the day after her trial, on the 9th of April 1836, she became the youngest woman in 19th century Gloucester to be hanged by the neck until she was dead.
The verses published in the broadsheets to celebrate her execution read as follows. Good people, all I pray attend unto these lines that I have penned. A criminal confined I lie, my crime is of the blackest dye. Harriet Tarver is my name. You'll hear from Camden Town in Gloucestershire. I own the dreadful deed I've done, and now my glass is nearly run. A loving husband once I had, which ought have made a wife's heart glad, but Satan he tempted him so, that I resolved the deed to do. To poison him was my intent, and to take his life I was fully bent. White arsenic I did apply, which for the same I'm condemned to die. By him a lovely child I bore, and alas I ne'er shall see it more. O Lord, thou be a parent kind to my orphan child which I leave behind. God grant it may a warning take of its mother's untimely fate. From the paths of vice and bad company, from all such crimes pray keep it free. When my trial came on you here, with a heavy heart I did appear. The jury they did guilty cry, and soon I was condemned to die. Back to the death cell I was ta'en, 48 hours to remain, and there my time to spend in prayer, hoping to meet my Saviour there. You married women, where'er you be, I pray take warning now by me. Pray love your husband and children too, and God his blessing will bestow. Hark, now I hear my passing bell, now I must bid this world farewell, and when the fatal bolt shall fall, the Lord have mercy on my soul. We move south now from Chipping Campden to Morton-on-the-Hill, for it's here that our next tale took place.
The Cotswolds was a perfect area for opportunistic thieves. In a rural region like this, there was a clear line between rich and poor.
Robert Jones fell clearly into the latter category. He regarded anyone wealthier than himself as fair game, and his last victim was a man called Stephen Matthews. Stephen was a farmer from Hinchwick, a village not far from Morton-on-the-Hill, and was known in the local community to be very wealthy. He regularly passed through here on his way to Evesham Market, where he sold his livestock.
One day, on Monday the 21st of May, 1767, having made the then large sum of £200, he got on his horse and started to ride the distance back home, which was about 15 miles. He took roads which can be taken today, what is now the A44 from Evesham to here at Morton-on-the-Hill, and then over the Bourton Downs, down narrow winding tracks to his home. His route would be well known to locals, including the criminal Robert Jones. In the 18th century, on horseback and in the dark, this route must have been distinctly scary and atmospheric. Highwaymen were known to frequent these kinds of tracks, but Matthews knew the area well and probably felt safe in such familiar territory. Robert Jones took advantage of this and lay in wait on the route to Hinchwick, hiding in some grass on the roadside, watching for Matthews to pass. It is unclear precisely what happened at this point, but it proceeded in as violent a manner as one might expect. One version of events suggests that as Matthews approached, he stopped to relieve himself on the grass verge, this making Jones's job easier. As Matthews remounted his horse with one foot in the stirrup, Jones rushed him and hit him on the head with a wooden paddle. He continued to hit him as he fell to the ground and then robbed him of 17.5 guineas. Matthew's body was found the following day with many injuries, suggesting gratuitous violence on Jones's part, encouraging the belief that this was a premeditated murder. As in our previous story, rumours spread like wildfire as to the culprit. Robert Jones had not been slightly careful since the event. He had paid off his debts to local innkeepers and boasted about the fact that he didn't need money. This immediately raised suspicions, and just 2 days after the murder he was apprehended by a Joseph Knight of Stow and Mr. Wilkes of Chipping Norton. Much of the stolen money was found on his person. He hadn't had much opportunity to spend it. He was committed to Gloucester Castle, where he continued to insist on his innocence. He claimed that a watch they found in his possession was a brand new one he'd purchased from a Broadway jeweller, but there was conclusive evidence that this watch had belonged to Matthews. It had received a new seal 2 days before the incident, and this same seal was found on the stolen watch.
A truly badly behaved prisoner, he was tried on August the 3rd and sentenced to execution. He was hanged on the 5th, and on the following day his body was brought here to Morton-on-the-Hill, where it hung bound in chains to act as a warning to other opportunistic thieves and criminals.
We continue south to the town of Stow-on-the-Wold. Murder and robbery, £200 reward, whereas a barbarous murder was committed on the evening of the 10th of March at Stow-on-the-Wold on the body of Mr. Francis James Renz of Stow aforesaid, and a gold watch taken from his person.
So reads a wanted poster issued after the death of Francis James Renz in 1834. It goes on to describe the stolen gold watch in some detail and states that a reward will be paid by Mr. John D. Charles of Stow-on-the-Wold, to who shall give such information as may lead to the conviction of the perpetrator or perpetrators of the said murder. The victim was François Jacques Renz, a Frenchman who came to live a quiet life in the English countryside. His name, as per the wanted poster, was anglicised by the locals. He'd been a businessman and a merchant working in the Netherlands, but had moved to England after the failure of his business.
After coming to England, he was seen as an upstanding member of the local community. He taught French, and in 1827 he managed to secure a position as the actuary of the Stow-Provident Bank. This is what brought him to Stow. He stayed at the George Inn in Market Square and would frequently walk around town after his evening meal.
Sadly, his habits made him easy to keep track of, and was consequently an easy target for opportunistic thieves. As in our previous story, there was a deep social divide at the time, and there was a general sense of economic misery for many living poorly in the rural communities. His landlord's daughter, Martha Rogers, had seen him leave for his walk at 7:30 p.m, and she knew he'd be back by 8 to drink tea. When he failed to return, she knew something was amiss. He had last been spotted at about 7:45, walking down Black Lane by a local man, Henry Sutton, who assumed him to be on his usual evening walk. Just minutes later, Renz was dead, hit over the head from behind with an iron bar.
He was found by Samuel Harris, who was out feeding his horses, who raised the alarm at the George Inn. An Inspector Adamson arrived from London to assist the local authorities, and as usual, many witnesses came forward with conflicting statements. It was eventually narrowed down to two main suspects, a Mr. Clifford and a Mr. Cox, but it soon became clear that these men had little motive, as they had their own trades and respectable incomes. The investigations continued for some time, until eventually another possible culprit was found. Edwin Jeffrey, a 21-year-old local labourer who had aroused suspicions by trying to take an expensive watch to a local watchmaker to have it mended. When questioned on how he came to have the watch, he said it had been a gift from his brother. The watchmaker was not convinced and went to the police. Jeffrey was arrested and put on trial. It came to light that he had waited near a local fish pond for Renz, had seen the watch hanging from his pocket and struck him down. Later, he had actually helped the locals take Renz's body back to the George Inn. He hid the watch for a time, but eventually taking it to the watchmaker for repair was to be his undoing.
He was hanged in Gloucester on the 15th of April 1835 and was seen praying up until the moment he finally dropped.
We journey to the southwest now, following the escarpment down to Winchcombe, one of the Cotswold explorers' favourite spots. There are a couple of dark stories, even here.
In 1864, in the heart of this beautiful town of Winchcombe, the 28-year marriage between Sarah Alexander and Richard Smith was in serious trouble. Sarah had thought she'd married well, as she had been an agricultural labourer and her husband was a respected surgeon. His brother William was a wealthy local farmer. All certainly seemed fine on the surface, but the truth was considerably less peaceful. Not long into their married life, Sarah discovered that Richard had a very dark side to his personality. It turned out his family had a history of insanity. They were Winchcombe born and bred, but two of Richard's uncles were generally known to have been mad, and one of his aunts had been sectioned in the 1830s and committed to the Gloucester County Lunatic Asylum. It seemed pretty likely that when they first married, Sarah had no idea of these family secrets.
There were many warning signs in Richard's behaviour. He had threatened to expel one of his brothers from his house for no apparent reason, and he broke all the windows in his sister Anne's house. In 1846, he was said to have caught brain fever and almost died. As their lives went on, Richard's insanity grew worse. When living in Devon for a spell, he became convinced that a signboard opposite his house was actually a camera documenting his daily movements. He would close all the curtains for days at a time to prevent anyone from seeing in. After a while, his family grew concerned, and in 1852 he was assessed by a Dr. Shapter, who concluded that he suffered from chronic insanity. Despite this, he was allowed to continue his normal life. In fact, his family grew as he and Sarah had their last child, Clara, before moving to London and then back to Winchcombe. Their children had grown up, dispersed, and were living normal lives in a number of different trades, but Richard's madness continued to get worse, and eventually his financial situation began to crumble. He rented a house in North Street in Winchcombe, relying on his brother William, who owned a nearby farm, for financial support. On the 27th of December, 1864, their children had spent the afternoon at Richard and Sarah's home. They were still on affectionate terms despite Richard's mad spells. They all left at different intervals, with the last of their children, James, leaving at 8:30 in the evening. It was half an hour later, at 9 p.m, that their neighbour, Mrs. Greenhalgh, heard a gunshot. She did not, at the time, investigate. The next morning, a Mrs. Wharton knocked on Richard's door, as she normally would, for some milk. She asked after Sarah, but received no reply. After she left, Richard walked to his brother William's farm, and William's son James answered the door. Richard asked for his sister, and as she joined them, he told them calmly that their mother had died. William had joined them too, and in a state of shock they all left for North Street to find out what had happened. Richard, meanwhile, went to Gloucester Street to tell his other children. William found Sarah dead and called a local surgeon. He found that she'd been shot through the neck, close to the base of the skull. They didn't have to look far for the weapon. It had been left still loaded on a nearby table.
On the 28th of December, 1864, Richard was charged with the willful murder of his wife, Sarah. In the prison records, Richard's entry stands out. Of his fellow prisoners, few were able to read and write, whilst this intelligent and well-educated doctor filled in his entries in full with excellent handwriting.
Despite Richard's defence that it could well have been an accident, his state of mind was the overriding factor. He was surprisingly calm and level-headed during the trial and refused to comment on his actions. He was eventually acquitted on the grounds of insanity. He was imprisoned in Gloucester for 1 year and then sent to Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, where he stayed until he died in 1833. Fortunately, his many children went on to live perfectly healthy lives, and no dark events took place in the family's history again. Winchcombe is also home to another sinister story of a reprieve that came too late.
Born in 1781, William Townley was a local tearaway and petty criminal. The Townleys were an old local family, and his parents were hard-working and law-abiding. But William and his brother John were made of different stuff. William was just 17 when he was first caught, red-handed in the act of burgling a local home.
He and his brother were sent to prison for 2 years, but it didn't seem to do William any good. Immediately after his release, he was back to burgling. In 1803, he was charged with a capital offence. At the time, punishment was pretty severe, and theft could easily incur the death penalty. Later, it was common to be deported to Australia. William was sentenced to be deported, but instead of actually being sent away, he was kept for 7 years on a convict ship at Woolwich, the Justitia. This boat had been used as a prison hulk since 1777 and was notorious for its appalling conditions. He survived this ordeal and was discharged on the 26th of July, 1810. At first, he tried to find legal ways of earning an income. He signed up to the Worcestershire militia, but squandered his initial pay packet of 10 guineas almost immediately, and he soon returned to his old ways of burglary to solve his financial difficulties, and in October 1810 he broke into the home of one George Skinner. He stole several things, including clothing, but he was promptly caught and once more imprisoned, this time in Gloucester. At his trial in March 1811, various witnesses testified against him, and the best he could do in defence was simply to claim they were all lying. Not surprisingly, he was sentenced to death. His execution date was Saturday the 23rd of March, as executions usually took place on the Saturday following the verdict. Unknown to William, events were taking place to give him another chance in life. The judge who had presided over William's trial was travelling to Hereford, and on his way he was told things that showed William in a much less hopeless light. The judge decided to grant him a reprieve.
From this moment, however, it all started to go wrong. The decision to reprieve William should have been sent to the Under-Sheriff of Gloucestershire, but went instead to Herefordshire. It sat in the Hereford post office until the next day, by which time the fleetest possible horse, taken by the messenger to Gloucestershire, wasn't fast enough to save the unfortunate youth.
When it finally arrived, William Townley had been hanging from the gallows for 20 minutes. A tragic tale. Here ends our gruesome Halloween adventures. We hope you enjoyed these horrific tales. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and visit our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk. Join us next week.
We round off tonight's programme with another selection of scary stories. If you want to listen to more of these tales, our audiobooks are available by following the links in the description of this video. Hello. You find me on the day of Halloween in the depths of the Cotswolds, and I'm searching for some of the most gruesome tales told about the area. There are many of them. Some terrible things have happened in the Cotswolds in the past. I'm going to find them, and then I'm going to read them to you. The Civil War in the Cotswolds resulted in some brutal and terrible actions. Conspiracy, deception, disloyalty, and revenge. The first story I'm going to tell you is what happened at Chavenage House. On a late December afternoon in 1648, a group of horsemen, led by Henry Ireton, son-in-law of Oliver Cromwell and leading parliamentarian, galloped along the rutted highways of the Cotswolds and then along the approach to Chavenage House. It was then that Henry Ireton and Nathaniel Stevens retired from the company and settled down to discuss the important matter that had brought him to Chavenage, the execution of their king, Charles I. With the Civil War now over and King Charles Stuart a prisoner, it had become apparent to Cromwell that the king would have to be executed
if royalist uprisings were to be deterred. However, many of his supporters had balked at the prospect of committing regicide. Amongst them was Colonel Nathaniel Stevens, a mild man who wavered in making the decision to sacrifice the life of the king, and who, as Ireton arrived at his door, had almost made up his mind against it. The two men are reputed to have sat up all night discussing and arguing the point, and it was with great reluctance that the next morning Stevens finally acquiesced. Ireton returned to London, and on January the 30th, 1649, Charles Stuart, King of England, was beheaded outside Whitehall Palace in London. The fortunes of Nathaniel Stevens fared little better than those of the king. His daughter Abigail had been away at the time of Ireton's visit. Returning shortly after the New Year, she was furious at her father for bringing the family name into such disrepute, and in her anger she placed a curse upon him. Soon afterwards, Colonel Stevens was taken terminally ill. Shortly after his execution in 1649, the headless ghost of the king is reputed to have appeared at Chavenage House during the funeral of Colonel Stevens. The servants reported a mysterious black carriage driven by a headless coachman pulling into the drive and bursting into flames as it passed through the gates. In my continued efforts to find you gruesome tales from the Cotswolds, I was reminded of a story about a young Mercian king, told by our normal literary companion, Herbert Evans. I think this is the story I'm going to tell you next. On the death of Kenelm, king of Mercia, in 822, his son Kenelm, a boy of 7 years, succeeded to the throne of Mercia. Winchcombe was then the royal residence, and there the little king began his reign under the guidance of his tutor, Ascobert. Fortunately, or unfortunately for him, he had an elder sister, Quenred, who cast envious eyes upon the lad and sought to supplant him on the throne. With this end in view, she attempted to take him off by poison, but so saintly was the holy child that the noxious drugs had no power over him. Her next move was to whisper evil counsels in the ear of his tutor, the mercenary Ascobert, and endeavour to win him over to her designs. In this she succeeded, and one fine morning Ascobert invited the boy to accompany him on a hunting expedition to the forest of Clent in the north of Worcestershire. Kenelm was, of course, delighted with the proposal, and off rode the villain and his victim. When they reached the forest, the miscreant cut off the child's head and buried the corpse beneath a thorn bush. It should be said that at the moment that he severed the head from the body, a white dove came forth from the neck and straightway flew up to heaven. Quenred now reaped the fruit of her misdeed, for a time. But it so happened that a year or two later, as the Pope was celebrating Mass at the high altar of St. Peter's at Rome, a dove flew into the building and dropped a slip of parchment upon the altar. His Holiness, observing a certain writing upon the parchment, attempted to read it, but without success, a thing which was not wonderful, seeing that the language was English, then an unknown tongue in the Holy City. At last an Englishman was found who could read and interpret the writing, which ran thus: In Clent, in Caubach Kellan, kings ben lith, under a thorn hoand buried. That is, in Clent, in Caubach, Kenelm king's child lieth under a thorn, his head taken from him. Thereupon the Pope lost no time in sending these strange tidings to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and orders came down to Winchcombe that a search should be made for the murdered child's body. Accordingly, a party of monks set off for Clent and arrived at the Cowbush, where a white cow, herself long a devotee of the saint, guided them to the thorn bush. Here they found the body, and were about to take it back with them to Winchcombe, when a difficulty arose. The monks of Worcester put in a claim to the body as having been found in their province, while the Gloucestershire men as vehemently asserted their claims as fellow townsmen of the saint. At last they agreed that, weary as they were, they should all lie down to sleep, and whichever party woke up first should be considered to be destined by the will of heaven to be the possessors of the relics. It chanced that the Winchcombe monks were the first to awake, and they were well on their way with their precious burden before their brethren of Worcester were aware of their departure. The return journey was managed without adventure till they reached a point high up in the hillside over against Winchcombe town, and some 2 miles distant therefrom. Here the good monks found themselves overcome with thirst, and offered up prayers that for the love of Saint Kenelm some refreshing drink might be granted to them. Immediately a second miraculous spring, for another had already appeared under the thorn bush in Clent, gushed forth from the hillside, a spring which was long famous for its wonderful healing properties. The spring was covered with a well house, which may be seen to this day, and a chapel was erected hard by, which was only pulled down in the last century. But to return to the convoy. Thus refreshed, the procession filed up Winchcombe Street on its way to the Abbey, and here a terrible thing happened. The wicked Quenrine, with her psalter in her hand, was watching the approach of the procession from a window of the palace. As appropriate to the occasion, she had chosen for recitation the 109th Psalm, in which the psalmist calls down the vengeance of heaven upon his adversaries. To render the charm more effective, when she reached the end of the psalm, she began to recite it backwards, and had just reached the 20th verse as her brother's corpse was borne beneath her window. But she got no further with her reading, for at this moment her eyes fell out upon the open psalter, and the book, stained with her blood, was thereafter piously preserved among the sacred treasures of the Abbey. I'm really enjoying this search for gruesome stories from the Cotswolds. It has reintroduced me to one of my favourite authors, H.H. Munro, commonly known as Saki. I have a small, poignant and wonderful story for you now, called The Reticence of Lady Anne. Egbert came into the large, dimly lit drawing room with the air of a man who is not certain whether he's entering a dovecote or a bomb factory, and is prepared for either eventuality. The little domestic quarrel over the luncheon table had not been fought to a definite finish, and the question was how far Lady Anne was in a mood to renew or forego hostilities. Her pose in the armchair by the tea-table was rather elaborately rigid. In the gloom of a December afternoon, Egbert's pince-nez did not materially help him to discern the expression of her face. By way of breaking whatever ice might be floating on the surface, he made a remark about a dim, religious light. He or Lady Anne were accustomed to make that remark between 4:30 and 6 on winter and late autumn evenings. It was a part of their married life. There was no recognized rejoinder to it, and Lady Anne made none. Don Tarquinio lay astretch on the Persian rug, basking in the firelight with superb indifference to the possible ill humour of Lady Anne. His pedigree was as flawlessly Persian as the rug, and his ruff was coming into the glory of its second winter. The page boy, who had Renaissance tendencies, had christened him Don Tarquinio. Left to themselves, Egbert and Lady Anne would unfailingly have called him Fluff, but they were not obstinate. Egbert poured himself out some tea. As the silence gave no sign of breaking on Lady Anne's initiative, he braced himself for another Yermak effort. "My remark at lunch had a purely academic application," he announced. "You seem to put an unnecessarily personal significance into it." Lady Anne maintained her defensive barrier of silence. The bullfinch lazily filled in the interval with an air from Iphigénie en Tauride. Egbert recognized it immediately because it was the only air the bullfinch whistled, and he had come to them with the reputation for whistling it. Both Egbert and Lady Anne would have preferred something from the Yeoman of the Guard, which was their favourite opera. In matters artistic, they had a similarity of taste. They leaned towards the honest and explicit in art, a picture, for instance, that told its own story with generous assistance from its title. A riderless warhorse with harness in obvious disarray, staggering into a courtyard full of pale, swooning women, and marginally noted "bad news," suggested to their minds a distinct interpretation of some military catastrophe. They could see what it was meant to convey and explain it to friends of duller intelligence. The silence continued. As a rule, Lady Anne's displeasure became articulate and markedly voluble after 4 minutes of introductory muteness. Egbert seized the milk jug and poured some of its contents into Don Tarquinio's saucer. As the saucer was already full to the brim, an unsightly overflow was the result. Don Tarquinio was prepared to play many roles in life, but a vacuum carpet cleaner was not one of them. "Don't you think we're being rather foolish?" said Egbert cheerfully. If Lady Anne thought so, she didn't say so. "I dare say the fault's been partly on my side," continued Egbert, with evaporating cheerfulness. "After all, I'm only human, you know. You seem to forget I'm only human." He insisted on the point as if there had been unfounded suggestions that he was built on satire lines, with goat continuations where the human left off. The bullfinch recommenced its air from Iphigénie et Tauride. Egbert began to feel depressed. Lady Anne was not drinking her tea. Perhaps she was feeling unwell, but when Lady Anne felt unwell, she was not wont to be reticent on the subject. "No one knows what I suffer from indigestion," was one of her favourite statements, but the lack of knowledge can only have been caused by defective listening. The amount of information available on the subject would have supplied material for a monograph. Evidently, Lady Anne was not feeling unwell. Egbert began to think he was being unreasonably dealt with. Naturally, he began to make concessions. "I dare say," he observed, taking as central a position on the hearthrug as Don Tarquinio could be persuaded to concede him, "I may have been to blame. I'm willing, if I can thereby restore things to a happier standpoint, to undertake to lead a better life." He wondered vaguely how it would be possible. Temptations came to him in middle age, tentatively and without insistence, like a neglected butcher boy who asks for a Christmas box in February for no more hopeful reason than he didn't get one in December. He had no more idea of succumbing to them than he had of purchasing the fish knives and fur boas that ladies are impelled to sacrifice through the medium of advertisement columns during 12 months of the year. Still, there was something impressive in this unasked-for renunciation of possibly latent enormities. Lady Anne showed no sign of being impressed. Egbert looked at her nervously through his glasses. To get the worst of an argument with her was no new experience. To get the worst of a monologue was a humiliating novelty. "I shall go and dress for dinner," he announced in a voice into which he intended some shade of sternness to creep. At the door, a final access of weakness impelled him to make a further appeal. Aren't we being very silly? A fool, was Don Tarquinio's mental comment as the door closed on Egbert's retreat. Then he lifted his velvet forepaws in the air and leapt lightly onto a bookshelf immediately under the bullfinch's cage. It was the first time he had seemed to notice the bird's existence, but he was carrying out a long-formed theory of action with the precision of mature deliberation. The bullfinch, who had fancied himself something of a despot, depressed himself of a sudden into a third of his normal displacement. Then he fell to a helpless wing-beating and shrill cheeping. He had cost 27 shillings without the cage, but Lady Anne made no sign of interfering. She had been dead for 2 hours. I hope you've enjoyed our stories. We certainly have. There are many, many more. I think we'll certainly do this again. Meanwhile, have a wonderful Halloween and keep safe. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's Halloween live stream. I hope you enjoyed our collection of tours and stories. Don't forget, subscribe to the channel and follow us on social media to gain access to even more of our content.